Welcome to Purbright Files, uncovering truths behind every mystery.
It was on one of those sleepy Tuesday afternoons in St. Mary, Mead, when the postman brought the strangest delivery the village had seen in years. Miss Jane Marple had been trimming her geraniums when she noticed Mr. Robbins. The postman, walking more slowly than usual, his brow furrowed and his hand holding a single postcard as though it were a poisonous snake. He stopped at her garden gate, gave her a stiff nod, and muttered something about, "Best you see this. Miss Marple, before it goes to the constable." The postcard was addressed in a neat, blockish script to Mrs. Elspeth Harrow, who lived in the ivy-covered house just beyond the village green. There was nothing particularly unusual about that, except that the postcard was spattered and smeared with what looked horribly like dried blood. Not much, but enough to turn the creamy cardstock into something grim and macabre. Miss Marple, who had seen a great many unpleasant things in her life, took it without flinching. The smear was across the lower right corner, as though a thumb had pressed against it, while the hand holding it was injured, or worse. She glanced at the picture side. It was a colour print of the Cornish coast, a wide, jagged cliff under a pale sky. Nothing remarkable. The message on the back, however, was brief and puzzling. "You forgot the truth, but the truth did not forget you. Tasha." There was no return address, no date beyond the postmark, which read London, Herefordshire, 1953. Mrs. Harrow was a respectable widow of 63, a woman of impeccable manners and a fondness for the Women's Institute. But Miss Marple also knew that Mrs. Harrow had once lived in London, and in her experience, people who spent a long time in big cities often had tucked-away histories they didn't speak about over tea. She decided the best course was to accompany Mr. Robbins directly to Mrs. Harrow's door. The widow answered with her usual graciousness, but the moment she saw the postcard, her face drained of colour. She took it in a trembling hand and stared at it so long that Miss Marple began to think she might faint. Then, as if catching herself, Mrs. Harrow stiffened, said, "This is some horrid joke," and tried to hand it back. Miss Marple's eyes caught something the others missed, a faint set of initials penciled near the stamp. DC. Barely visible, almost rubbed out. Before either woman could speak again, there was a commotion in the lane. Constable Reeves arrived, looking flustered. He had news. The London police had just rung through. A man named Douglas Cray had been found murdered in a Bloomsbury boarding house the previous evening. And here Reeves looked awkward. The only item found on his person, apart from a few coins and a broken watch, was a small scrap of card torn from a postcard showing the Cornish coast. It was stained with blood. Mrs. Harrow swayed as if she might collapse. Reeves quickly guided her to a chair, and Miss Marple, eyes bright behind her spectacles, asked in her quiet way, "And where precisely had the card been torn?" Reeves hesitated. "Right across the top. No writing on it, just the picture of the cliff." Now the thing became most curious indeed. If the murder victim had part of the postcard and Mrs. Harrow had the other, then the two pieces had once been whole. But who had sent it? And more importantly, when? The London postmark said the card had been mailed yesterday, but the murder had occurred before dawn. This meant the card had been posted after Cray's death, or by someone who had planned it in advance. Miss Marple, with her gift for appearing harmless, sat quietly while Reeves made notes. She knew better than to press Mrs. Harrow in front of an audience, but her mind was already at work, knitting together threads. The initials DC matched the dead man's name. That suggested he was the sender, unless someone wanted it to look that way. And what of the strange message? "You forgot the truth, but the truth did not forget you." Such words did not belong to random village gossip. They were the language of old wrongs. By the time Reeves left, Mrs. Harrow was pale and withdrawn. Miss Marple asked if she might stay for a cup of tea, and once they were alone, she gently inquired about Douglas Cray. At first, Mrs. Harrow claimed never to have heard of him, but Miss Marple noted the way she twisted her handkerchief, the brief tightening around her eyes. A lie certainly, but not the careless sort. This was a lie told to protect something deep. As they sipped their tea, Miss Marple let the conversation drift to London in the 1920s, parties, dances, the bustling streets, and saw Mrs. Harrow's guard slip. Just a little. Yes, she had been there. Yes, she had known a great many people. But when Miss Marple mentioned the East End, the widow flinched as though touched by a hot iron. Before Miss Marple could press further, a sharp knock came at the door. It was a young man, dark-haired, London accent, with the look of someone who'd been living rough. He handed Mrs. Harrow a folded note and left without a word. She read it quickly, crumpled it in her fist and muttered something about nonsense before excusing herself to the kitchen. Miss Marple caught only a glimpse of the note, but it was enough. A single line scrawled in haste, "They know about the night at Rook's Point, the Cornish cliff," on the postcard. The cryptic message, "A murdered man in London with part of the same card." And now a reference to a place called Rook's Point. Miss Marple had never heard of it, but she felt certain it was no mere tourist attraction. Her instincts told her that whatever had happened there was the heart of this mystery, and somewhere, in the spaces between Mrs. Harrow's silences, a truth was waiting, one that someone had already killed to keep hidden. Miss Marple knew she would not sleep until she found it. Miss Marple left Mrs. Harrow's house with the light fading over the green, the air cool with the faint scent of late roses. To the casual eye she looked much as she always did, quiet, a little frail, the sort of woman whose mind one would never suspect of plotting routes through tangled human secrets. But behind her mild expression, the pieces of the day's events were turning over in steady, deliberate order. She stopped at the post office under the pretense of buying a packet of notepaper and found Mr. Robbins still there, sorting the last of the day's letters. With a few well-placed remarks about the dreary weather in Cornwall, she got him to confirm that the postcard had been placed in Mrs. Harrow's delivery that morning, mixed among several ordinary envelopes. Nothing had seemed odd about it until the faint brownish smears caught his eye. She thanked him and stepped back into the lane, turning the matter over. Whoever had sent that card had taken the trouble to make it appear ordinary, until the stain turned it into something else entirely. And yet the stain, if it truly was blood, could hardly be accidental. The next morning, a sleek black Wolseley pulled up outside Mrs. Harrow's house. A tall man in a tailored grey suit emerged, his manner brisk but courteous. Detective Inspector Archibald Willis had been sent down from Scotland Yard to speak with the widow. Reeves trailed behind, slightly flushed at having to play second fiddle to the London man. Miss Marple, never one to waste an opportunity, happened to be trimming the lavender hedge opposite and could hear enough to make her efforts worthwhile. Willis's voice carried clearly. "You knew the deceased, Douglas Cray, before this week?" Mrs. Harrow's pause was only a second too long, but Miss Marple's ear caught it. "No, I don't believe so," the widow said, her tone a fraction too steady. "Yet his name, or rather his initials, appear on the card sent to you. I can't explain that. Perhaps it's meant to frighten me. So I have no idea why." Willis stepped inside with her and Reeves shut the door behind them. Miss Marple could no longer hear the words, but she had seen the flicker in Mrs. Harrow's eyes, like the twitch of a curtain revealing a glimpse of the room behind. That, she knew, was not the look of a woman puzzled by a stranger's death. It was the look of someone taking care to say only part of the truth. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple encountered Inspector Willis again, this time outside the small tea-room. He had the sort of air men sometimes have when they've not found quite enough to be satisfied, but just enough to suspect something is there. She invited him to sit for tea, ostensibly as a kind village gesture, and he, perhaps amused, agreed. In the course of their polite conversation, he mentioned that Cray had been killed by a single clean thrust to the heart. No sign of struggle, no forced entry into his room. Whoever had done it had either been let in willingly or had possessed a key. A curious point, Miss Marple remarked, given that boarding-house landladies rarely allow their keys to stray. Willis nodded, adding that Cray had been staying under an assumed name, and that a search of his belongings had turned up nothing but the torn postcard and the broken watch. Miss Marple, stirring her tea, asked whether the watch might have been broken in the course of the murder. "Unlikely," Willis replied. "The damage looks deliberate. Glass removed, works jammed with something. Almost as if someone wanted it to stop at the wrong time." That, she thought, was an interesting detail indeed. It was a quiet way of altering the record, a false clock to muddy an alibi, perhaps. Willis admitted they were tracing the origin of the postcard. The image, it seemed, was not a current print. The Cornish coastline shown was Rook's Point, but in the photograph the old lighthouse still stood, though it had been demolished in 1947 after a landslip. The card itself must have been printed before then. That placed it at least 6 years old, and that meant, Miss Marple realized, that the card was not a hurried purchase from a London kiosk. It was something kept, something someone had held on to, perhaps waiting for the right or wrong moment. That evening, Willis walked to the Harrow house again, this time asking to see her writing desk. Mrs. Harrow allowed it with stiff formality. As he leafed through her papers, Miss Marple, who had been just passing and invited in, noticed something he did not at first remark upon. There in the shallow top drawer was a sheet of blotting paper with the faint ghost of an address visible in reverse. Miss Marple bent closer, ostensibly admiring the smoothness of the desk's inlay, and saw clearly enough, Rook's Point Lighthouse, Cornwall. If Willis noticed her interest, he gave no sign. But as they left, Miss Marple's mind was alive with the certainty that Mrs. Harrow had written to someone, or about something, connected with that lighthouse, and that she had done so recently enough for the ink to remain visible on the blotter. Back in her own cottage, Miss Marple sat knitting and thinking. The authorities would pursue the obvious leads, trace Cray's last movements, speak to the London boarding house residents, test the postcard for fingerprints. But she had seen what they had not. The way Mrs. Harrow's hands trembled when Rook's Point was mentioned, the deliberate avoidance in her eyes when Willis asked about her past, and, most telling, the ghostly address left behind in the blotter. There was deception here, she was certain. Not the grand theatrical kind that shouts its presence, but the quiet sort, a rearrangement of facts, a subtle shifting of the truth just far enough to mislead. And Miss Marple, with her lifetime study of human frailty, knew that such deceptions often hid the most dangerous truths. Inspector Willis began his round of formal questioning the next morning, setting up in the small reading room of the vicarage, a neutral ground where no villager could complain of bias. Miss Marple, of course, had no official standing, but she had the habit of being useful at just the right moment, by a combination of offering tea, arranging chairs, and being the sort of quiet presence no one considered a threat. She ensured she was on hand to observe. The first to be questioned was the young man who had delivered the crumpled note to Mrs. Harrow's door. His name was Peter Larkin, 24, a drifter who had come to St. Mary Mead only 2 weeks before, doing odd jobs at the Swan Inn. He admitted to being the messenger, but claimed he didn't know the note's contents. "Bloke in London posted it to me," he said, scratching the back of his neck. "Told me to give it to the lady, no questions asked. Paid me £1 for the trouble." Willis pressed him on who this bloke was, but Peter insisted he'd never seen the man before. Tall, wearing a cap, kept his coat collar up. Didn't seem friendly. Miss Marple noticed the young man's eyes flick to the side every time he denied knowing more. Not the wide-open gaze of the truth-teller, but the narrow glance of someone editing his own story. Next came Mrs. Bostock, the Harrows' long-time charwoman, who had been in service there for nearly 15 years. She claimed Mrs. Harrow had been nervous-like ever since the morning the postcard arrived, but also angry in a way I hadn't seen before, proper cross. When Willis asked if she had ever heard of Douglas Cray, Mrs. Bostock pursed her lips and said no. But then, as she spoke about Mrs. Harrow's younger days, she let slip that the mistress used to get letters from London regular up until about 5 or 6 years ago. Willis caught it instantly and stopped suddenly. She nodded. Like someone had turned off a tap, Miss Marple stored that away. It matched the date of the lighthouse's demolition, 1947, meaning that whatever had happened at Rook's Point had ended some correspondence. But it also hinted at a possible rekindling now. The next to be questioned was Mr. Henry Cook, the landlord of the Swan Inn. He was a stout, genial man, happy to supply beer and gossip in equal measure. He claimed Peter Larkin had been a good lodger, quiet and punctual, but then admitted that Larkin had received 2 telegrams in the last fortnight, unusual for a man with no people and no steady job. When asked if he'd seen the senders, Cook shook his head. But Miss Marple caught the way he fiddled with his cuff, a sure sign, in her long experience, that a man was omitting something to keep his own name clear of trouble. Willis next brought in Mr. Robbins, the postman, who repeated the story of finding the blood-stained postcard in the morning mail. But when asked if the card had looked fresh from the postbag, Robbins hesitated. "Well, it's a funny thing, sir. The postmark said London, But the card felt a bit. He searched for the word. Handled. Like it had been through more than one set of hands before mine. A small thing. But Miss Marple caught the implication. Someone local might have touched it before it officially arrived. By now, a pattern was forming. Every witness had given something useful, but none had given the whole truth. The contradictions were subtle, more about tone and omission than outright falsehood, and each seemed to have their own small reason for shading the story. The last person to arrive was Mrs. Harrow herself. She carried herself with dignity, though the faint tremor in her gloved hands betrayed her strain. Willis began gently recapping the facts, the postcard, the message, the murder of Douglas Cray. She maintained she did not know the man. But under further questioning, she conceded that she had once visited Cornwall years ago and had seen Rooks Point. A pretty place, she said too quickly. I recall very little else about it. Miss Marple's gaze, mild and blue, lingered on her. The woman's voice was steady, but her eyes gave her away. They darted to the window whenever the conversation approached certain dates or names. Most telling of all was when Willis produced the blotting paper. We found the impression of an address to Rooks Point Lighthouse, he said. Mrs. Harrow looked at it without surprise, without even curiosity. I expect it's from an old letter I kept in the drawer, she said. But there was no hesitation, no feigned confusion, the sort of smoothness that comes only from a prepared answer. When she left, Willis sat back, rubbing his chin. They're all hiding something, he said. Trouble is, it's not clear which lies matter and which are just to save face. Miss Marple, still knitting, said mildly, Oh, they all matter, Inspector. People lie for small reasons and large, but the small reasons often point to the larger. One only has to find the thread. She looked up at him. And it is my experience that when several people tell partial truths, the complete truth is often something they are all equally afraid of. That night, she made her own quiet round of the village, visiting under the guise of returning borrowed books or delivering small baskets of scones. From Mrs. Bostock, she learned that the Harrow house had once had a locked trunk in the attic, removed only last month. From Mr. Cook, she coaxed the admission that one of Peter Larkin's telegrams had been from Penzance. And from young Lily Robbins, the postman's niece, she heard a curious detail. Her uncle had complained the morning of the postcard that some fool had tried to slip an unstamped card into the outgoing mail slot at the post office the night before. By the time Miss Marple returned to her own cottage, the picture was still hazy, but the shadows within it were beginning to take shape. There was Rooks Point. There was a trunk removed from the attic. There was a murder in London with a torn postcard, and there was a web of half-truths holding it all together. She set down her knitting and looked into the fire. Somewhere in this village the truth was already known, spoken in guarded tones, passed in quiet looks, concealed in those tidy, careful answers given to Inspector Willis. And she knew from long habit that sooner or later, one of those voices of deception would slip. When it did, she intended to be listening. The following morning brought a chill mist over St. Mary Mead, the kind that muffled footsteps and made even familiar lanes feel like they held secrets. Inspector Willis arrived at the Swan Inn early, determined to pull the scattered threads into something resembling a pattern. Miss Marple, as was her habit, had anticipated him and was already there, seated with a modest pot of tea, her knitting needles clicking softly. Willis laid out his notes with a frustrated air. They all have motives, he said, and none of them fit neatly together. It's like trying to do a jigsaw where half the pieces are from another picture. Miss Marple, eyes still on her knitting, murmured, Perhaps they are. In my experience, Inspector, people rarely commit themselves to a single purpose. They act for more than one reason, though they'll only admit to the least compromising. They began with Mrs. Harrow. On the surface, a respectable widow with no debts and no enemies, at least none admitted. But there was the matter of the old correspondence from London, abruptly ended after 1947. If Douglas Cray was the correspondent, why had the letters stopped? A quarrel? A betrayal? If so, the arrival of the postcard could mean someone was reopening a wound long closed. And then there was the attic trunk, removed so recently. Willis had yet to discover where it had gone. Her motive could be fear, Willis said. If Cray knew something damaging, she might have wanted him silenced. But that doesn't explain the blood-stained card arriving after his death. Next came Peter Larkin, a drifter with no steady work, suddenly in receipt of money from a London stranger, and telegrams, one traced to Penzance not far from Rooks Point. He claimed ignorance about Cray, but if he had been the link between Cornwall and London, then perhaps he'd been paid to carry messages, or to ensure one never reached its destination. Greed seemed his likely driver, but greed alone didn't explain why he lingered in the village after delivering the note. Mrs. Bostock, the charwoman, had the smallest apparent role yet. She claimed loyalty to Mrs. Harrow, but Miss Marple had caught the undercurrent of resentment in her voice. 15 years of service, and no sign she'd risen in the household's favour. If there had been some scandal in the past, one that she knew about, it could be a source of leverage. Fear of exposure could cut both ways. Perhaps she feared Mrs. Harrow, or perhaps she feared what the truth might do to her own standing. Then there was Mr. Cook, the landlord. He seemed to have nothing to do with the matter beyond letting Lark in rooms, yet he'd concealed what he knew about the telegrams. He'd been in Cornwall once himself, years ago. Miss Marple remembered his fond talk of a fine holiday near Penzance, so close to Rooks Point that one could walk it in an afternoon. Perhaps he knew more about that place than he admitted. Jealousy was not out of the question. Jealousy often had little to do with romance, and much to do with who held a secret or who stood to profit. And finally, the postman, Robbins. His account of the postcard's arrival contained just enough uncertainty to invite suspicion. If the card had passed through more than one set of hands before him, perhaps he knew whose. A man in his position could easily slip a letter into the delivery unnoticed. But why would he? Idle curiosity? A favour for someone? Or perhaps to cover his own connection to the sender? Willis sighed, rubbing his temples. Every one of them could be tied in. And yet, each time I think I see it, the lines don't connect. The murder, the postcard, the lighthouse, how do they all meet? Miss Marple, still knitting, replied quietly, "At the heart of any maze, Inspector, there is usually one thing, a treasure, a prisoner, or a danger. We must decide which it is in this case. Perhaps the lighthouse was once the heart, and everything else is the hedge grown around it." They turned to alibis. Mrs. Harrow had spent the night before Cray's murder at home, according to Mrs. Bostock, who had left at 9 o'clock. But there was no one to vouch for her movements after that. Peter Larkin had been at the Swan Inn that evening, seen in the bar until 10:30, but could have caught the night train to London if determined. Cook, too, had no firm alibi beyond his own statement. Robbins had been on his usual post route the day before, but his evening was unaccounted for. And Mrs. Bostock's own movements after leaving the Harrow house were vague. Home and straight to bed, a phrase that usually meant the exact opposite. Willis had gathered a timeline, but it was full of gaps. Cray had last been seen alive at 7:30 in the evening by his landlady. Sometime before dawn he had been stabbed. The postcard, postmarked after his death, meant someone had either pre-posted it and altered the mark, or had access to post after the fact. And the torn half in Cray's pocket suggested he'd received it, or had taken it, from someone before the fatal encounter. Miss Marple's mind ticked over. If the lighthouse had been demolished in 1947, and the card was older than that, then it was likely a keepsake from a specific time. Such keepsakes were not kept without meaning. The fact that both halves had surfaced, one with the dead man, one with Mrs. Harrow, meant they had once been together. It was a link the murderer could not have intended to be obvious, yet here it was. She spoke almost idly. "The trouble with motives, Inspector, is that we look for one that explains everything. But in truth, each person here may be working toward their own end. Some ends overlapping, others in conflict. One person's fear may be another's greed, and the same act may serve both." Willis frowned. "Are you saying two people could have acted independently, each thinking they were working toward their own goal and together?" "Exactly. Like two gardeners, each pruning for different reasons, but both shaping the same hedge. The difficulty is knowing which cut shaped the maze and which merely followed the path already there." They decided to test the theory. Willis had the constable quietly check the local rail station records for tickets purchased to London the night of the murder. A single third-class ticket had been bought for the 11:04 train. The name given was Cook, but Miss Marple knew enough about the casual dishonesty of small places to suspect the name on a ticket was worth little. In the afternoon, Miss Marple took a slow walk past the Harrow house. In the side lane, she caught sight of Peter Larkin speaking in low tones to Mrs. Bostock. When they noticed her, they broke apart, Larkin heading toward the inn, Bostock disappearing around the back of the house. That suggested at least some collusion. Whether they were allies or merely exchanging scraps of advantage remained to be seen. By evening, the fog had lifted from the village, but not from the case. The motives were all there: fear in Mrs. Harrow, greed in Larkin, possible jealousy in Cook, self-protection in Bostock, and perhaps misplaced loyalty in Robbins. But no single one explained the bloodied postcard, the torn halves, and the murder. Miss Marple set aside her knitting and looked out her sitting-room window at the faint glow from the Harrow house. Somewhere within this tangled web was the thread that led back to Rook's Point, to whatever had happened there before the lighthouse came down. Until she pulled that thread free, the maze would remain, and the murderer would walk its paths untroubled. But she was patient. She had walked more than one maze in her time, and she knew if one kept to the wall and never lost touch, it was always possible to find the heart. The breakthrough came, as such things often do, with a burst of excitement from entirely the wrong quarter. 2 days after the tangle of interviews, Constable Reeves arrived at the Swan Inn looking so self-satisfied that Miss Marple immediately suspected trouble. She was taking tea by the hearth when he strode in, carrying a brown evidence envelope as though it contained the crown jewels. "Inspector Willis will want to hear this right away," Reeves said, puffing slightly. "I've found the knife, Miss Marple." The murder weapon. Within the hour, Willis had it laid out on the table in the reading room of the vicarage, a slim, stiletto-like blade with a dark wooden handle. Reeves explained that he had discovered it in the ash pit behind the Swan Inn, half buried under cinders. The handle was scorched, but the blade still bore a reddish-brown stain, quickly confirmed by the Yard's lab to be human blood. And there was more. The blade was wrapped in the torn remains of a telegram envelope addressed to Peter Larkin. Willis acted swiftly. Larkin was brought in, pale and scowling, and placed under arrest. The young man protested loudly, swearing he had nothing to do with Cray's death. But the circumstantial picture looked damning. He had been paid to deliver a suspicious note to Mrs. Harrow, received telegrams from Cornwall, and now the murder weapon had been found behind the very place he lodged. The newspapers wasted no time in declaring it a swift resolution, the London press hinting that the Yard had outwitted a dangerous criminal in record time. But Miss Marple, sitting quietly in the corner as Larkin was led away, felt no sense of resolution. If anything, the neatness of it all pricked her like a burr. Things in real life, she knew, were rarely tied up so quickly unless someone wanted them tied up. That afternoon she took her customary walk through the village, allowing her thoughts to settle into their usual order. She could see why Willis felt confident. Larkin had no strong alibi, and the knife's location was damning. And yet, she paused at the lane behind the Swan Inn, where Reeves claimed to have found the blade. The ash pit lay beside a low wall, the kind a man could easily toss something over without crossing into the yard. The angle from the back lane was perfect for such a throw. Larkin's room overlooked the opposite side of the building. He would have had to make a deliberate journey round to the back to hide it there. Possible, yes. Convenient, certainly, but perhaps too convenient. In her mind, she began to turn over the small details: the scorched handle, the fact that the telegram envelope had survived the ash pit's heat, and the curious neatness of the paper's fold around the blade. That was not how someone in a panic would hide a weapon. They would toss it in, perhaps wrap it quickly in rags, but not fold and tuck paper around it, as though preparing a parcel. The next morning she visited Mrs. Harrow under the pretext of returning a novel she had borrowed. The widow seemed relieved at the news of Larkin's arrest. Too relieved, Miss Marple thought, as though the outcome had been a private blessing rather than justice served. They sat over tea, and Mrs. Harrow remarked that perhaps the village can breathe again now. Perhaps, Miss Marple replied, her voice mild. Though I do wonder, if Mr. Larkin were indeed guilty, why would he linger in the village at all after the murder? Why not vanish? Mrs. Harrow's hand stilled on her teacup for the briefest moment before she answered. Some men think themselves cleverer than the police. They stay hoping to bluff it out. A possibility, Miss Marple conceded, but her mind was already elsewhere. She was thinking of the trunk removed from the attic, the one Mrs. Bostock had mentioned. If Larkin had truly been the killer, what role could that trunk have played? And why had Mrs. Harrow been so quick to believe in his guilt? That evening, Willis stopped by her cottage, triumphant but willing to indulge her doubts. "The knife's a solid piece of evidence, Miss Marple. Even the yard's satisfied. Larkin's prints were on the handle. That's as good as a signed confession. Were they now?" she asked, peering over her knitting. "Only his prints?" Willis hesitated. "Well, there were others, but smudged. Could have been from before. The handles would, hard to lift clear impressions." "Indeed," she murmured, clicking her needles. "And did it occur to you, Inspector, that prints on a knife do not necessarily mean the person wielded it in anger? One could handle a knife for any number of reasons, before it was used for murder or after." He gave her a wry look. "You think someone planted it?" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that someone wished to be rid of a more dangerous suspect, and they have been successful for the moment." 2 days later, Larkin's formal confession was expected, but instead he grew sullen and silent, repeating only that he'd been set up. Willis treated it as bluster, but Miss Marple's doubts deepened. She had noticed how certain villagers, Mrs. Harrow, Mr. Cook, even Robbins the postman, had adopted a peculiar air of relief since the arrest. The air of people who believed they had escaped attention. On the 3rd evening after Larkin's arrest, Miss Marple took a long, slow walk past the Harrow house. In the dim light of the hallway, she glimpsed Mrs. Harrow speaking to someone in the doorway, a tall man in a cap, his coat collar turned up. The moment Miss Marple's shadow crossed the gate, the man stepped back into the darkness and vanished up the lane. The real criminal, she thought, was still moving freely through the village, confident that the knife in the ash pit had closed the matter, and perhaps it had, at least for the police, but not for her. She returned to her cottage and set her knitting in her lap. There was a larger game afoot, one that went back years, perhaps to the time of the old lighthouse and the letters from London. Whoever had killed Douglas Cray had done so with calculation and had managed to turn the authorities toward a convenient scapegoat. But false victories, Miss Marple knew, had a way of collapsing. All it took was one thread pulled from the weave, and she already had her fingers on it. Late that evening, long after the village had settled beneath a cloak of quiet, Miss Marple sat by the fire with a small stack of worn papers and yellowed envelopes spread before her. The lamp's soft glow illuminated her thoughtful face as she methodically examined each scrap, each faded signature and cryptic line of correspondence. The parcel of letters had arrived anonymously that afternoon, slipped beneath her door in a plain brown envelope, without so much as a note. Yet their contents promised to unravel more than one thread tangled deep within the mystery. The letters were dated from the mid-1940s, their paper brittle with age and ink faded but still legible. Most were addressed to a DC or Douglas Cray, and bore the postmark of a small Cornish village. Many referenced Rook's Point and the old lighthouse in passing, as though speaking of a place both cherished and feared. One letter, written in a delicate hand, spoke of secrets better left beneath the waves, and the night when the light went out forever. Miss Marple's keen eyes lingered on that phrase. The lighthouse, demolished in 1947, had not just vanished physically, it had taken with it something far more vital, a past that someone wished to bury. The correspondence revealed a web of relationships none of the police had suspected. One letter from Mrs. Elspeth Harrow, dated 1946, spoke candidly to Douglas Cray about a shared misfortune. "If the past is a chain," she had written, "then we both wear its shackles. Yet only silence can set us free." Another letter, penned by a man named Henry Cook, thanked Douglas for a favor done in the dark days of '46, and expressed a hope that old debts might soon be repaid. A cold thread ran through the words, a hint of betrayal cloaked in polite phrases. It became clear that these were not mere acquaintances, but people bound by a secret, and a secret that had shaped their lives since the immediate aftermath of World War II. Miss Marple sat back, folding the letters gently. The removal of the trunk from Mrs. Harrow's attic suddenly took on new weight. Whatever was inside it must have been connected to this shared past, and the sudden resurfacing of Douglas Cray in London with a half of a postcard was no accident. It was a message, one that the murderer had wanted delivered, perhaps as a warning or a threat. The next day, Miss Marple arranged to speak privately with Mr. Henry Cook at the Swan Inn. Over a modest glass of cider, she gently probed about his connections to Cornwall and the shadow of the war years. Cook's jovial mask slipped briefly as he confessed to having served in a covert capacity during the war, part of a small group involved in intelligence work along the southwestern coast. Rook's Point was strategic, he admitted, voice dropping. We kept watch there, sent coded messages from the lighthouse before it was abandoned. But what happened afterward? That was something else entirely. When pressed, Cook's gaze darkened. There were people who knew too much. Some things don't die with a war. They linger waiting for the wrong moment to rise again. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. And your letters to Mr. Cray? Were you part of this lingering danger? Cook hesitated, then nodded. Yes and no. Douglas was my friend once. We were bound by more than service. But when the war ended, we discovered that the lines we'd drawn in the sand were not so clear. Loyalties shifted, and some old friends became enemies. The pieces began to click into place. Peter Larkin, the young drifter, might be the unwitting courier of messages too dangerous to be sent openly. Mrs. Bostock's resentment might have stemmed from knowledge long buried, perhaps even fears for her own safety. Mrs. Harrow's pale dread was not merely the worry of a widow, but the anxiety of a woman trapped by a past she could neither escape nor reveal. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple visited Mrs. Bostock under the pretense of inquiring about household matters. The older woman's eyes flickered with unease when the subject turned to the trunk. It held papers, she whispered, and something else, something that could ruin lives if it got out. When asked about the night Douglas Cray was killed, Mrs. Bostock's composure cracked. He came back that night, said he had to finish what we started years ago. I begged him not to, but he never listened. What was it, Mrs. Bostock? Miss Marple pressed gently. The charwoman looked around as if fearing eavesdroppers. There was a shipment, a secret, hidden in the lighthouse before it was torn down. Some of us wanted it forgotten. Others wanted it found. As twilight deepened, Miss Marple left Mrs. Bostock's cottage with a mind full of shadows. The crime was no longer simply a murder born of immediate motives. It was the final act of a story that had begun long before any of them had set foot in St. Mary Mead. The tangled relationships, the hidden debts, the bloodied postcard, all pointed to a past that refused to stay buried. Back in her sitting room, she pulled out the torn halves of the postcard once more, placing them side by side under the lamp's warm glow. The image of the lighthouse, standing tall against the Cornish sky, seemed less a postcard and more a memorial, to a secret, to a betrayal, and to a danger that had finally come home. Somewhere in the village the shadows of the past still moved, and the heart of the mystery was waiting to be uncovered. The village of St. Mary Mead had settled into an uneasy calm, but Miss Marple knew that beneath the surface, tensions simmered like coals waiting to flare. The tangled past had begun to shed light on the present, yet the full picture remained obscured by half-truths and guarded glances. The puzzle demanded a new approach, one that might pry loose the secrets hidden behind practiced smiles and carefully measured words. That morning, Miss Marple invited Inspector Willis to her cottage, under the pretext of discussing the case over a pot of tea. She had decided to test the nerve of the villagers, to introduce a subtle pressure that might reveal what conventional questioning had failed to uncover. People, she began, stirring her tea thoughtfully, are not always aware of the stories they tell themselves. Sometimes the best way to reveal a secret is to unsettle the storyteller. Willis nodded, intrigued. And how do you propose we do that? I intend to stage a small gathering, a casual tea with the suspects present, she explained. A chance encounter, nothing formal. We shall see how they behave when confronted with a scenario designed to provoke. Word spread quickly, as such events do in a small village. Mrs. Harrow, Mrs. Bostock, Mr. Cook, and even the postman Robbins all agreed to attend, though some with visible reluctance. Peter Larkin, still held under guard, was not invited. Miss Marple arranged her sitting room with care, placing a framed photograph of Rook's Point Lighthouse prominently on the mantelpiece. It was an old image, the same as that on the torn postcard, showing the lighthouse standing proud against a stormy sky. As the guests gathered, polite conversation filled the room, but Miss Marple could see the tension beneath the surface. Small shifts in posture, quick glances exchanged, fingers twitching nervously. Midway through the gathering, she asked an innocuous question. Have any of you ever visited Rook's Point recently? The room fell silent, save for Mrs. Harrow's faint intake of breath. Mr. Cook spoke first, his voice steady but with a trace of defensiveness. I haven't been there in years. It's hardly a place for a village like ours. Mrs. Bostock's eyes flickered toward the window. No one goes there anymore. It's too dangerous, Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. I heard there's been some recent activity. Strange lights, unexplained noises. Stories, of course, but they remind me of old ghost tales. The mention of ghost tales seemed to unnerve Mrs. Harrow most. She clutched her teacup tightly, her knuckles pale. Miss Marple, sensing the shift, turned her attention gently to the postman Robbins. And you, Mr. Robbins? Have you noticed anything unusual on your rounds? Strange deliveries, odd packages? Robbins shook his head quickly, but a bead of sweat glistened on his temple. Miss Marple then casually pulled a small object from her pocket and placed it on the table, a faded piece of paper, folded and creased. This, she said softly, was found tucked behind a loose floorboard in Mrs. Harrow's attic. The room went still. The paper was a fragment of a coded message, filled with symbols and numbers that at first glance made little sense. Miss Marple explained it was likely related to the wartime intelligence work mentioned earlier by Mr. Cook. She watched closely as Mrs. Harrow's eyes darted to Mr. Cook, and then to Mrs. Bostock. The three exchanged subtle looks, too quick for anyone else to catch, but to Miss Marple they spoke volumes. To those who lived through the war and its secrets, Miss Marple said, these symbols might mean safety or danger. Then came the moment she had anticipated. Miss Marple turned to Mrs. Bostock and remarked, "You seem uneasy, my dear. Are these old memories troubling?" Mrs. Bostock's composure cracked. Her face flushed, and she suddenly rose from her chair. "Enough," she said sharply. "This game is cruel. You dig up bones best left to rest. What good will it do to expose wounds that only bring pain?" The outburst was unexpected and stark. The room fell silent, all eyes upon her. Miss Marple inclined her head gently. "Sometimes healing begins with truth, Mrs. Bostock." The older woman's defiance wavered, and she sank back into her chair, eyes moist. "You don't understand. Some secrets are dangerous, not just for us but for all of St. Mary Mead." It was then that Miss Marple noticed a small tremor in Mrs. Harrow's hands, a flicker of guilt that hadn't surfaced before. Turning her attention to the widow, she asked quietly, "Mrs. Harrow, can you tell us why this message was hidden in your attic? And what does it say about Douglas Cray?" Mrs. Harrow's eyes met Miss Marple's. For a moment, silence stretched between them. Finally she spoke, voice barely above a whisper. "It is a warning that some things from the past are better left forgotten. Douglas came back because he believed the truth could set us free, but I fear it only brought death." As the evening wound down, Miss Marple felt the subtle but unmistakable shift. The psychological pressure, the symbolic artifact, and the gathering of suspects in close proximity had stirred emotions and cracks in their carefully constructed facades. Later, as Willis helped escort the guests from the cottage, he confessed, "You're right, Miss Marple. Sometimes the heart of a mystery isn't in the facts, but in the silences and shadows between them." She smiled gently. "And sometimes it takes an unconventional key to unlock those shadows." Alone by her fire, Miss Marple placed the coded message alongside the torn postcard halves. The past was stirring, and the fragile web of deception was beginning to unravel. The real story, she knew, was ready to come to light, but only when the final threads were pulled taut. The next morning dawned cold and grey, with a persistent drizzle that seemed to seep into the bones of St. Mary Mead. The village was already whispering about the revelations from Miss Marple's gathering, and Inspector Willis felt a renewed confidence in the case. For the first time, the tangled web appeared to be loosening its grip, threads beginning to separate and reveal the pattern beneath. Miss Marple herself was seated by the window of her sitting room, her knitting resting idle in her lap as she studied the coded message once again. The symbols hinted at something vital, something that could connect the past to the present murder, but she needed more time and resources to decipher it fully. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Constable Reeves entered, his face unusually pale. "Miss Marple, sir, there's been a problem at the vicarage." "What sort of problem?" she asked, setting aside her knitting. The trunk from Mrs. Harrow's attic, the one removed last week, it's gone missing, along with several documents and personal effects that had been stored inside. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Gone missing? How is that possible? Willis arrived moments later, his usual composure shaken. We secured the vicarage thoroughly after Mrs. Harrow agreed to hand over the trunk and its contents for examination. Yet when the constable checked this morning, the entire trunk and its papers were gone. Was there any sign of forced entry? Miss Marple asked. No, none. The door was locked, windows latched. Whoever took it knew exactly where to look and when. The implications were immediate and alarming. Whoever had removed the trunk was clearly desperate to conceal something critical enough to risk discovery. The timing suggested an inside job, or at the very least, knowledge of the police's movements. Miss Marple sat back thoughtfully. This is no mere theft. It is an attempt to bury the past before it can be unearthed. The investigation turned swiftly. Willis arranged for a discreet search of the village, questioning those with access to the vicarage and Mrs. Harrow's household. Yet every lead twisted into a dead end. No one admitted to seeing or hearing anything unusual during the night. Meanwhile, Miss Marple's intuition urged her to look closer at those already under suspicion. If the trunk held the secrets of the war years and the connection to Douglas Cray, then someone among the suspects must have known what was at stake and acted to prevent its exposure. She paid a visit to the post office where Robbins, the postman, worked. His usual cheerful demeanor was replaced by nervous glances and a tendency to avoid eye contact. When she gently asked if he'd noticed any strange deliveries or removals from the vicarage, he shifted uncomfortably. I might have seen a shadow, miss, he admitted quietly, but it was late and I wasn't sure. Her gaze sharpened. A shadow is all it takes sometimes. The following day brought news that sent ripples through the small community. A burnt bundle of papers had been found discarded near the old quarry outside the village. The remains were barely recognizable, but forensic experts confirmed they were likely fragments of documents related to the Harrow household. Miss Marple examined the ashes with a mixture of sadness and resolve. The past does not like to be uncovered, she murmured. But fire cannot destroy what is remembered, nor silence what is spoken in time. Trust between the villagers began to fracture. Mrs. Bostock grew increasingly withdrawn, and Mr. Cook was seen frequently pacing by the inn's back door, his expression darkening with every passing hour. Even Mrs. Harrow herself seemed a shadow of her former self, her eyes haunted by guilt or fear, or both. Miss Marple realized that the vanishing trunk was more than just a lost piece of evidence. It was a message, a warning to anyone who sought to unravel the deeper mystery. The stakes had risen, and the game was no longer just about solving a murder. It was about unearthing a truth that some would kill to protect. That evening, as a heavy fog rolled in from the surrounding fields, Miss Marple sat by her fire, turning over the pieces in her mind. The coded message, the torn postcard, the missing trunk, they were all parts of a puzzle that refused to be silenced. Her fingers tightened around her knitting needles. The shadows grow longer, she whispered to the room, but so does the light. And sooner or later, one will outlast the other. The chill of early autumn had settled over St. Mary Mead, and with it came a brittle unease that clung to the village like fog. Miss Marple had barely had time to digest the latest developments, the stolen trunk, the burnt documents, and the growing web of suspicion, when a fresh tremor of alarm shattered the fragile calm. It was just past midnight when a sharp, insistent knocking disturbed her slumber. Rising carefully from her bed, she opened her door to find Constable Reeves, his face pale and eyes wide with urgency. "Miss Marple, you must come quickly," he whispered. "There's been another attack at the Swan Inn." By the time she reached the inn, a small crowd had gathered, murmuring anxiously beneath the flickering street lamps. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of smoke and spilled ale. At the back of the dimly lit room lay Mr. Henry Cook, the landlord, unconscious and bleeding from a deep gash across his temple. Nearby, a shattered glass glistened on the floor, and the heavy oak chair he'd been sitting in was overturned. Inspector Willis was already there, directing the constables with brisk efficiency. "It looks like a deliberate assault," he said grimly. "Someone wants him silenced or scared into silence." Miss Marple knelt beside the injured man, noting the careful precision of the wound. "This was no random scuffle," she murmured. "A warning, perhaps, or a desperate attempt to keep secrets buried." Cook's eyes fluttered open briefly, and he grasped her hand weakly. "The past. It's coming back," he rasped before slipping again into unconsciousness. The attack sent shockwaves through the village. If Cook, one of the key figures tied to the wartime secrets, could be targeted so brazenly, then the murderer was not only ruthless, but dangerously confident. The stakes had been raised beyond solving a cold case. Now it was a race to prevent another tragedy. Miss Marple gathered the villagers in the vicarage the following day, her voice steady but grave. "We are dealing with a cunning adversary, one who knows the winding paths of this village and is willing to strike to keep the truth hidden. We must be vigilant." Peter Larkin, still held under suspicion, was visibly shaken by the news. He claimed to know nothing of the attack, but admitted he had seen Cook speaking urgently with Mrs. Harrow late the previous evening. "They looked worried," Larkin said, "like they were hiding something." Mrs. Harrow denied any confrontation, but the tension in her voice betrayed her unease. "Mr. Cook has been under strain," she said carefully. "We all have." Miss Marple turned her attention to Robbins, the postman, who had been unusually absent from the village during the night of the attack. When questioned, he stammered a vague explanation about visiting a sick relative in a nearby town, but no one could confirm his story. That evening, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, a sense of urgency weighing heavily upon her. The attack was a stark reminder that the case was far from closed, and that the murderer still held the advantage. As she sat by the fire, she carefully pieced together the timeline. Cook's assault likely happened after dark, possibly after he had attempted to retrieve or protect a vital piece of evidence. The stolen trunk and the burnt papers were attempts to erase the past, but someone now was willing to use violence to keep those secrets safe. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock. It was Lily Robbins, the postman's niece, her eyes wide with worry. "Miss Marple," she said in a hushed tone, "I think my uncle is involved. I overheard him talking on the phone last night. He sounded scared but also angry. He mentioned someone named Douglas and said, 'They don't understand what's at stake.'" Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Thank you, Lily, that is most helpful." The next day, with the village buzzing with rumors and fear, Miss Marple confronted Robbins directly. Under gentle but persistent questioning, his composure finally cracked. He admitted to being involved in the concealment of certain documents from the trunk, and acknowledged knowing more about the wartime secrets than he had let on. "I only wanted to protect the village," he said desperately. No one meant for anyone to get hurt. But the attack on Cook proved the danger had escalated beyond simple protection. The murderer was willing to silence anyone who threatened to expose the truth, no matter the cost. Miss Marple knew the path ahead was perilous. The next move would come from the shadows, and she must be ready, not only to solve the murder of Douglas Cray, but to stop the darkness from claiming another victim. As dusk fell over St. Mary Mead, she prepared herself for the game's final, deadly turn. The village had not quite recovered from the shock of Henry Cook's brutal assault when Miss Marple found herself wandering the narrow lanes of St. Mary Mead in the waning light of afternoon. The mist, still hanging like a veil over the fields and rooftops, seemed to press down on her thoughts, heavy with the weight of unanswered questions. Inspector Willis, though outwardly resolute, confessed privately to Miss Marple his growing frustration. "We have suspects, motives, fragments of a story, but no clear thread to tie it all together." She nodded, acknowledging his weariness. "Sometimes, Inspector, the truth hides in the smallest of details, the things we overlook because they seem insignificant." That evening, back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat quietly with a cup of tea, her eyes drifting to the small collection of objects she had gathered from the various scenes. The torn halves of the postcard, the faded coded message, the scorched telegram envelope, and an assortment of trinkets from Mrs. Harrow's attic. Her fingers idly traced the delicate edges of a handkerchief embroidered with the initials EH. Had been found tucked inside the trunk before it. Disappeared. Mrs. Harrow's initials, no doubt, but it was the faint scent it retained. A sharp, almost metallic tang. That caught Miss Marple's attention. Her mind returned to the postman, Robbins, whose nervous glances and evasive answers had grown more suspicious by the day. He had been the one to deliver the blood-stained postcard, yet he had shown reluctance to speak of its origins. And then there was the oddity of the telegram envelope, wrapped carefully around the murder weapon, an act too precise for a panicked murderer. Suddenly, a memory surfaced, the casual mention by Mrs. Bostock during the tea gathering of a habit that seemed trivial at the time. Mrs. Harrow, she said, had the peculiar practice of marking her letters and important documents with invisible ink, a faint, near imperceptible mark that could only be seen under certain light. Miss Marple retrieved a small portable ultraviolet lamp from her cabinet and turned it on, bathing the embroidered handkerchief in a pale blue glow. To her surprise, faint letters appeared beneath the fabric's surface, letters that spelled out a secret code. The discovery sparked a rush of clarity. The coded message was not merely an arcane relic of wartime intelligence. It was a key to the invisible marks Mrs. Harrow had placed on her documents, a system designed to track communication and secrets without arousing suspicion. Miss Marple realized that the blood-stained postcards' halves were part of this system, symbols to warn or communicate danger. Whoever had murdered Douglas Cray had been trying to stop these messages from being revealed, but the killer underestimated how well the secrets were hidden in plain sight. She arranged a meeting with Inspector Willis and presented her findings. The murderer is someone who knew about Mrs. Harrow's secret markings and attempted to destroy any evidence that could expose them. Willis frowned. But who would have that knowledge? And why? Miss Marple smiled faintly. That is the question. And I believe the answer lies in the relationships formed during the war, alliances born out of necessity, loyalty and betrayal. Their next step was to revisit the suspects with this new perspective. Mrs. Harrow's apparent fear was no longer just about her past, but about the coded system she maintained. Mr. Cook's knowledge of intelligence work made him a likely candidate for both protector and threat. Robin's role as postman gave him the opportunity to intercept or manipulate messages. Mrs. Bostock's secretive nature and sudden outburst hinted at deeper involvement. As they interviewed the villagers again, the pattern of interactions began to reveal itself. Who had been where, who had access to which documents, and who had the means to orchestrate the murder and the subsequent attempts to cover it up. Miss Marple's patient unraveling of these details painted a picture of a complex network, not just a single crime, but a decades-old struggle for control of dangerous knowledge. That night, as she arranged the torn postcard halves under the lamp once more, the detective felt a quiet resolve. The key had been hidden not in grand gestures, but in the small, overlooked details, the invisible marks, the embroidered initials, the careful folds of paper. In the stillness of the room, Miss Marple whispered to herself, "The pattern was here all along, waiting for us to see it. And now the truth can no longer hide in the shadows." The crisp dawn light filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's sitting room, casting delicate patterns across the worn carpet. After days of probing, piecing together fragments of the past and present, the moment to confront the heart of the mystery had arrived. The village's fragile calm was poised on the edge of revelation. Inspector Willis sat opposite Miss Marple, his brows furrowed, awaiting the culmination of her thoughts. She had called together the key villagers, not as suspects yet, but as witnesses to a truth that could no longer remain hidden. The vicarage's drawing room was suffused with a heavy silence as the gathering settled. Mrs. Harrow sat stiffly, her hands trembling slightly. Mr. Cook's gaze was guarded. Mrs. Bostock, ever watchful, seemed to shrink into the shadows, and Robbins, the postman, looked every bit the nervous man he had been all along. Peter Larkin was absent, held securely at the station, no longer the center of suspicion. Miss Marple began softly, "We have long suspected that the crime which claimed Douglas Cray's life was born not of simple greed or vengeance. There is a deeper wound, one rooted in the past and the burdens it cast upon us all." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. "The true motive is not money, nor is it power. It is fear. Fear of exposure, of disgrace, and the shattering of carefully constructed identities. The village has lived with a secret born from wartime shadows, a secret so perilous that some believed it worth killing to protect." A faint gasp escaped Mrs. Harrow, and her eyes filled with tears. Miss Marple continued, "During the war, A covert operation took place at Rooks Point Lighthouse, involving those present here. This operation was not just intelligence gathering, but something far more delicate, an arrangement made to conceal an event so shameful, so devastating that it would ruin lives if revealed. Mr. Cook shifted uncomfortably. "It was an accident," he muttered, voice thick with guilt. "A misstep during the operation that resulted in innocent lives lost. And the documents hidden in the trunk," Willis asked. "They contained the names and details of those involved, and of those who chose silence over truth," Miss Marple replied. Douglas Cray had returned to ensure that the story would be told, perhaps to seek forgiveness or redemption. The room seemed to close in as the villagers absorbed this revelation. Then Mrs. Bostock spoke, her voice trembling but clear. "Douglas was no saint. He threatened to expose us all, to destroy the lives we had rebuilt." Miss Marple looked at Mrs. Harrow, who finally broke down. "I was young and scared. I believed keeping the secret was protecting the village. And myself." Robbins swallowed hard. "I was just the postman. But I knew enough to be afraid." The detective's eyes settled on Mr. Cook. "You took drastic measures because you believed the truth would destroy everything." Cook nodded miserably. "I never wanted bloodshed, just silence." But the silence became a curse. Miss Marple's voice softened. "And so when Douglas Cray returned, the past demanded its price." The motive was clear now, not simple revenge, but a desperate attempt to bury a collective guilt, to preserve fragile peace built on lies. As the villagers grappled with the truth, Miss Marple understood the tragedy was more than a murder. It was the shattering of illusions, the reckoning of a community with its own conscience. The shadows of the past had finally stepped into the light, exposing a human frailty that no evidence could fully capture. The afternoon sun cast long shadows over the village green as Miss Marple arrived at the Swan Inn, her eyes steady and calm beneath the brim of her modest hat. The time had come to draw the tangled threads of this dark tapestry into a final knot, to confront the one who had pulled so many strings from the shadows. Inside the cozy inn, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Inspector Willis stood by the hearth, his expression taut but trusting in Miss Marple's quiet assurance. The villagers had gathered under the pretense of a routine meeting, but all knew this was no ordinary occasion. Miss Marple moved deliberately to the center of the room, her voice soft but unwavering. "Thank you all for coming. We've uncovered much, secrets, fears, and long-buried truths. But there is one among us who believed these shadows would never reach them." A faint murmur rippled through the assembled faces, some avoiding others' eyes, others betraying barely concealed tension. She turned to face Mrs. Harrow directly. "Elspeth, you have carried the heaviest burden of all, haven't you?" Mrs. Harrow's lips trembled, but she said nothing. "Douglas Cray's death," Miss Marple continued, "was not a simple murder of passion or greed. It was an act born from fear of exposure, from a desperate need to protect what could not withstand light." The widow's composure broke. Tears spilled freely as she whispered, "I never meant to kill him." "No," Miss Marple said gently. "But your hands are not entirely clean." She paused, then gestured toward the corner where the missing trunk, recently recovered from a hidden cellar beneath the inn, sat open, its contents scattered and illuminated by the fading daylight. The documents you destroyed, the threats you made, and the attempt to silence Mr. Cook, all pieces of a puzzle that formed a map to this moment. Mrs. Harrow's breath quickened. "He came to ruin us all. I only wanted to protect the village." "Protection at a deadly cost," Miss Marple replied. Suddenly a noise interrupted the tense stillness, the sharp clatter of a chair tipping over. All eyes snapped toward the back of the room, where Robbins, the postman, stood with a wild look in his eyes, clutching a small pistol. "Enough of this," he shouted, voice cracking. "You think you can unearth all the dirt and walk away? No more secrets. No more lies." The room froze. Willis moved toward Robbins cautiously, but Miss Marple stepped forward, calm as ever. "Mr. Robbins," she said softly, "violence will not serve you now. It will only deepen the shadows." Robbins's grip on the pistol faltered, the desperation in his eyes flickering with doubt. "You have lived in fear for too long, but the truth, painful as it is what sets us free." Slowly, Robbins lowered the weapon, collapsing into a chair with a broken sigh. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Sometimes the greatest courage is in surrender." Inspector Willis moved swiftly, securing the pistol and placing Robbins under arrest. As the villagers exhaled a collective breath, Miss Marple addressed the room one last time. The darkness has been brought to light, and with it the chance for healing begins. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, bathing St. Mary Mead in a warm, forgiving glow. The case was closed, but the echoes of the past would linger, a reminder that even the deepest secrets can never remain buried forever. The village of St. Mary Mead had begun to breathe again, the oppressive weight of fear and suspicion lifting as the dawn of truth broke over its rooftops. The arrests were made, the confessions given, and the community slowly returned to its rhythms, whispering about the ordeal as one might about a passing storm. Miss Marple had retired to her cottage, allowing herself a moment's rest by the hearth, confident that justice had found its mark. Yet, as twilight seeped through the lace curtains, a subtle unease gnawed at her thoughts. The puzzle, though seemingly complete, still held a missing piece, a shadow flickering at the edge of the light. The evening's letter arrived unexpectedly, a small envelope, heavy with the scent of old paper, and sealed with a delicate wax stamp bearing no insignia. Inside was a single sheet, written in a precise hand, the message brief yet chilling. You have uncovered much, but the truth remains incomplete. Look again where the past and present converge. The final hand is yet to play. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she reread the cryptic note. It was an invitation or a warning to delve deeper, to question the certainty of the recent resolution. The next morning she revisited the Swan Inn, seeking out Inspector Willis. There's been a development, she said quietly, placing the note in his hand. It suggests someone else may be involved, someone we have overlooked. Willis frowned, skepticism shadowing his features. After all that has come to light, you think there's another layer? I do, Miss Marple replied, and I believe it lies within the very heart of this village. Their investigation resumed with renewed vigor. They revisited the recovered trunk, poring over documents with fresh eyes. It was then that Miss Marple's gaze landed on a set of correspondence previously dismissed as routine, letters signed only with the initials M.G. Curiosity Piqued. She sought out the village records and discovered that M.G. belonged to Margaret Gale, a woman of unassuming presence, a lifelong resident who had so far escaped suspicion entirely. Known mostly for her quiet demeanor and charitable works, she had been seen often in the background. A familiar face, yet seldom noticed. Miss Marple arranged to meet Mrs. Gale at her modest home, where the woman greeted her with warm hospitality but cautious eyes. Miss Marple, she said, I've heard rumors and I fear the truth may hurt many. I hope to understand. Mrs. Gale, the detective replied gently. Under subtle questioning, Mrs. Gale revealed a startling secret. She had been an informant during the war, working covertly to protect the village from harm. But more importantly, she had witnessed tensions within the wartime group that foreshadowed the tragic events at Rook's Point. She had tried to mediate between those who wished to keep silence and those, like Douglas Cray, who sought to expose the truth. I feared that if the past was revealed, it would tear apart the community, Mrs. Gale confessed. So I took measures to control the narrative, to protect what I believed was the greater good. Miss Marple's mind raced. Could Mrs. Gale be the unseen hand manipulating events, the true mastermind orchestrating the concealment of secrets and the silencing of those who threatened them? Returning to the village square, Miss Marple and Willis called a meeting of the key players once more. In the charged silence, Miss Marple revealed Mrs. Gale's role, not just as a peacemaker but as the architect behind the smokescreen of lies and misdirection. Faced with the weight of exposure, Mrs. Gale's resolve crumbled. She admitted to intercepting communications, planting false evidence, and even encouraging threats to maintain order. Her intentions, though misguided, had led to unintended consequences. Douglas Cray's death and the subsequent attacks. As the villagers absorbed this revelation, the fragile veneer of safety shattered again. Yet in the light of truth, there was the promise of genuine reconciliation. Miss Marple looked around the room, her eyes resting briefly on each face, knowing that justice had been a winding path, not just a matter of crime and punishment, but of confronting the shadows within ourselves. The case was closed, at last, not with a simple ending, but with the complex grace of truth fully revealed. And as the sun rose over St. Mary Mead, It brought with it the quiet hope that even the deepest secrets, once uncovered, could lead to healing. The sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, casting a golden hue across the village as its inhabitants moved about with cautious normalcy. Yet beneath the surface, the tension of recent revelations had not fully dissipated. The final unveiling of Margaret Gale's role in the dark saga had shocked many. But it did not bring the closure some had hoped for. Miss Marple stood quietly near the edge of the village green, watching the townsfolk as they resumed their routines, some with relief, others with lingering suspicion. Inspector Willis approached, his face grim yet respectful. "You did it, Miss Marple. You uncovered the truth no one else could see." She smiled faintly, but her eyes held a shadow of sorrow. "Truth is a complex thing, Inspector. Revealing it is only part of the journey. Justice, true justice, is often more elusive." That evening, a meeting was convened in the vicarage to discuss the next steps. The villagers, shaken but determined, sought resolution. Yet as they awaited the outcome, a sudden absence was noted. Margaret Gale was nowhere to be found. A search began immediately, but as days passed it became clear. Mrs. Gale had vanished without a trace. Miss Marple, in a private conversation with Willis, shared her thoughts. She knew the walls were closing in. The weight of guilt, the fear of imprisonment, it drove her to flee. "But she escaped justice," Willis said, frustration evident. "Perhaps," she replied softly, "but justice is not always served in courtrooms. Sometimes it resides in the truth being known, in the lessons learned, and in the vigilance of a community." Reflecting on the case, Miss Marple explained the hidden clues that had eluded others. The blood-stained postcard was not merely a threat, but a carefully coded message, linked to Mrs. Harrow's system of invisible marks, a method designed to communicate warnings during a time when trust was scarce. The torn halves symbolized a fractured secret, a past that could not be mended without risk. The assault on Mr. Cook was an act of desperation by those desperate to bury the truth, yet it only served to illuminate the shadows further. Most tellingly, the unassuming presence of Margaret Gale, quiet, charitable, trusted, allowed her to manipulate from behind the scenes, controlling narratives and diverting suspicion. Miss Marple's keen observations had not only solved the crime but exposed the fragile human vulnerabilities at its core. As the village settled into a new equilibrium, there remained an unsettling truth. While the mastermind had fled, the ripples of her actions would echo for years to come. Standing by her window that night, Miss Marple gazed at the moonlit fields beyond, contemplating the nature of justice and truth. Sometimes, she mused aloud, justice is a journey without a clear destination, but as long as we seek it with courage and compassion, the darkness can never fully triumph. And with that thought, the village of St. Mary Mead turned a page, marked by sorrow, but also by hope for a future less shadowed by secrets. The morning sun filtered gently through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's sitting room, casting soft patterns onto the well-worn carpet. The village of St. Mary Mead was slowly returning to its quiet rhythm, the extraordinary events of recent weeks settling into the murmur of local gossip and cautious relief. The case was closed, or so it seemed. Miss Marple sat by the window, a steaming cup of tea in her hands, her gaze drifting toward the familiar streets beyond. She had watched the villagers move on, but her mind lingered on the fragile web of secrets that had entangled them all. The truth had been revealed, justice pursued, yet a subtle unease stirred in her heart. The note, that brief enigmatic letter sealed with unmarked wax, its final words, "The final hand is yet to play." The message had haunted her thoughts since its arrival, hinting at layers of the mystery yet undiscovered. Her eyes fell upon the torn halves of the postcard, carefully laid out on the small table beside her. Despite all the revelations, a single symbol carved into the faded paper remained unexplained. A delicately drawn spiral, almost imperceptible unless you knew to look for it. Miss Marple's fingers brushed lightly over the mark, tracing its curves. It was an ancient symbol, one she had encountered years before in an old village manuscript, linked to local folklore about cycles of fate and hidden truths. What connection could it have to the modern crimes that had shaken St. Mary Mead? Her thoughts were interrupted by a gentle knock at the door. It was Lily Robbins, the postman's niece. her expression curious yet cautious. "Miss Marple," she said softly, "I found this among my uncle's things." She handed over a small worn notebook, its pages filled with cramped handwriting and cryptic notes. Opening the notebook, Miss Marple found sketches, coded entries, and references to places and people beyond the immediate circle of suspects, hints of a wider network. Perhaps, or another layer of the story waiting in shadow. As she scanned the pages, one line caught her eye. "When the spiral turns again, the past will rise to meet the future." The detective smiled faintly, her mind already weaving new threads from the old tapestry. "Thank you, Lily," she said. "It seems our work is not quite finished." With the notebook tucked safely away, Miss Marple prepared to leave her cottage, stepping into the crisp morning air. The village behind her seemed peaceful, but the mysteries it held were far from over. As she walked down the lane toward the churchyard, a soft breeze stirred the autumn leaves. Somewhere in the distance a church bell tolled, marking the passage of time and the promise of secrets yet to unfold. The story of Douglas Cray, Margaret Gale, and the shadows of Rook's Point had reached its close, but the spiral of mystery was turning once more. Miss Marple knew that, as always, beneath the surface of quiet villages lay hidden depths, waiting for those with the patience to uncover them. And so, with a thoughtful glance back at St. Mary Mead, she stepped forward into the unknown, ready for whatever puzzles awaited her next.